casserole dish slipped from my hands when I saw the look on my mother-in-law's face. Not the dish shattering on the kitchen floor, not the mess spreading across the tile I'd spent 20 minutes mopping that morning. Her face. The way it didn't move, the way she looked at the ceramic fragments and then at me, and then said very quietly to my husband across the room, "She's always been clumsy." He didn't correct her. He just picked up his phone again. "My name is Devin Marsh. I'm 31 years old. I work in healthcare administration for a hospital network in Charlotte, North Carolina. I manage contracts worth more than most people's mortgages. I've been promoted twice in 4 years, and for the better part of 3 years, I convinced myself that the slow erosion of who I was had nothing to do with the man I married or the woman who raised him. I was wrong about that, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I met my husband at a mutual friend's birthday party in 2020. His name was Caleb. Caleb Bren, the kind of man who reads the room instantly and adjusts accordingly. Warmer with the women, funnier with the men, charming in that low-effort way that makes you feel like you've been chosen rather than targeted. He had this habit of leaning slightly toward whoever he was talking to, like what you were saying was the most important thing happening in any room. I fell for it completely. He was attentive in the early months. Remembered small things, the name of my college roommate, that I didn't like cilantro, that I always got cold in movie theaters. He texted just enough. He made dinner reservations and actually showed up on time. My friends liked him. My dad shook his hand and said, "That one's solid, Dev." His mother was another story. Patricia Wren entered my life the way weather enters a house. You don't notice the chill right away. You just find yourself reaching for a sweater. She was polished in that old Southern way, the kind of woman who says, "Bless your heart," and means 17 different things by it. She had opinions about everything and delivered them as observations. She didn't say I wasn't good enough for Caleb. She said things like, "I just want to make sure he's taken care of the way he's used to," while looking pointedly at the dishes I left to soak. The first Thanksgiving I spent with them, she redid the table setting after I'd set it. Didn't say a word. Just moved each fork 2 inches to the left and repositioned the centerpiece while I was in the bathroom. Caleb saw it and said nothing. I told myself that was fine, that she was from a different generation, that she was protective of her son, that I just needed to try harder. I got very good at trying harder. We got married in October 2021. Small ceremony, backyard at his parents' property in Waxhaw. His mother wore cream. I noticed but said nothing. The photographs turned out beautiful. I remember looking at them and thinking, okay, this is good. This is going to be good. The crack started about 4 months in. It was small things at first. He didn't like when I worked late, which I had to do sometimes because my job required it. He framed it as concern. "I just miss you, and I feel like you're married to that place more than you're married to me." I started logging off earlier, skipping optional trainings, turning down a committee position I'd been asked to join. Then it was friends. He had this way of expressing discomfort without saying he was uncomfortable. He'd go quiet when I made plans. He'd be fine when I left, slightly off when I got home, and never quite explain why. I started declining invitations without being asked to. It was easier. Then, it was my clothes. He didn't tell me what to wear. He told me what he liked. There's a difference, technically. But when the things he didn't like covered most of my wardrobe, the effect was the same. His mother accelerated all of it. She called 3 or 4 times a week. Long calls, always when I was home, always with Caleb on speakerphone, so I could hear both sides. She had opinions about our apartment, our meal planning, what we did on weekends. Caleb would listen and nod and sometimes implement what she said before he'd even consulted me. I raised it once. One time, I said calmly that I felt like his mother had a lot of influence over decisions that were ours to make. He looked at me like I'd said something cruel. "She's my mother, Devin." "I know that. She's just trying to help." "I know. I don't understand why you have such a problem with her." And just like that, the conversation became about my problem, my unreasonableness, my inability to accept love from his family. I apologized. I'm still not entirely sure what for. By year 2, I'd shrunk into a version of myself I barely recognized. I socialized less. I second-guessed my own opinions before voicing them. I over-explained my schedule, my purchases, my choices to a man who had never technically told me I had to. He had never raised his voice at me. He had never called me a name. What he'd done was, quieter and harder to name, A sustained pressure, invisible and constant, like being held underwater by one hand while the other waved to everyone watching from the surface. His mother was the hand. The breaking point didn't come in a single moment. It came in layers. Layer 1 was a promotion. In the spring of last year, I was offered a director-level role at the hospital. Significant salary increase. More responsibility, yes, but the kind of advancement I'd been working towards since I was 26. I came home and told Caleb, and he said, "That's great, babe," and turned back to the television. 2 days later, his mother called. I wasn't supposed to hear the full conversation, but I was in the hallway and the door to the bedroom was open. She was telling him that a director role would mean I was more focused on my career than on building a family, that it wasn't the right time for us, that she'd spoken to his aunt, who'd taken a similar role, and the marriage had suffered. Caleb came out of the bedroom and said, "I've been thinking, is now really the time for something this big?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to take the job, Caleb." He didn't fight me on it, but something shifted. The silences got longer. The warmth got conditional. Layer 2 was money. I had my own accounts. I'd always been careful about that, not because I didn't trust my husband, but because I'd watched my grandmother become financially dependent on a man who made her feel grateful for every dollar. And I decided early that would never be me. I kept my direct deposit in my personal account, and we had a joint account for household expenses. Caleb had never objected to this arrangement until he did. About 8 months ago, he came to me with what he called a proposal. He wanted to consolidate our finances. One account, both names, everything combined. He framed it as simplicity as unity, as what married people do. I'm a contracts person by profession. I read things carefully. The credit union paperwork he brought home would have made me equally liable for a line of credit I hadn't known he'd opened. $42,000, drawn against what he'd told me was a fully funded home improvement loan from 2 years ago. I signed nothing. I said I'd look it over. He said it was straightforward. I said I knew, and I'd look it over. What I found when I looked it over was not straightforward. I have a friend from college, Nessa, who does forensic accounting for a litigation firm in Raleigh. I asked her to dinner. By the time our entrees arrived, she'd agreed to take an informal look. By the time we finished dessert, she had questions. By the time she finished, she had answers. The line of credit wasn't the only debt. There were two others, one tied to a business venture he'd never mentioned to me, one that appeared to be covering losses on investments his mother had encouraged him to make. The combined total was just under $90,000. He needed my clean credit and my salary. That was what the account consolidation was actually for. I kept this information very, very close. I didn't confront him. I didn't change my behavior. I went on making dinners and attending his family's Sunday lunches and smiling at his mother's comments about how maybe Devin could pick up a hobby to keep herself grounded. I was grounded. I was just grounded in a way none of them understood yet. Layer 3 was Easter Sunday. His entire family gathered at his parents' house in Waxhaw. His two brothers, their wives, 3 kids between them, his grandmother, 2 cousins, and a man named Roy who was apparently an old family friend and attended every gathering as though he were related by blood. 20 people in a house that seated 12 comfortably. I'd been asked to bring a casserole. I made the one I always made, chicken and wild rice, my grandmother's recipe, the one Caleb had eaten 3 times and said he loved. I carried it in through the garage door, and his mother looked at the dish and said, "Oh, I thought you were bringing the green bean thing. You asked for a casserole. This is what I make." I just thought, after last time. She tilted her head. "Never mind. We'll make it work." During dinner, Caleb's older brother made a comment about the rice being undercooked. It wasn't. 3 other people had seconds, but Caleb didn't say anything. After dinner, while I was helping clear the table, his mother pulled me into the kitchen. Just the 2 of us. She closed the door halfway and said in a very reasonable tone that she wanted to talk to me about something. She said she was worried about Caleb, that he hadn't seemed happy, that she could see he was stressed, and she thought some of it had to do with my independence. The word landed with weight, and that perhaps I was making things harder than they needed to be. I asked her what she meant. She said she meant the job, the accounts, the way I pushed back on decisions. She said that Caleb was a man who needed to feel like a provider, and that it was hard for him when I competed with that I remember looking at the dish rack beside the sink and thinking about all the words I didn't say in that kitchen, all the times I'd bitten the inside of my cheek and redirected and softened and made myself smaller so Caleb could feel bigger. "I'll think about what you said," I told her. She patted my arm. "That's all I'm asking." I walked back into the dining room. Caleb was laughing at something his brother had said. He looked up at me and smiled, and I smiled back, and I felt something go very still inside me. The planning started the next morning. I called Nessa and told her I needed everything documented. Every account, every debt, every liability tied to Caleb's name. I called an attorney. Her name was Diane. Now I'll just say she was a family law attorney in Charlotte with a reputation for being meticulous and not sentimental. I sat in her office for 2 hours with a folder of documents, and she asked me at the end, "How long have you been collecting this?" I said, 8 months. She said, "Good. The thing I want to be honest about is this. I didn't plan what happened at Easter lunch because I wanted revenge. I planned it because I knew that if I confronted Caleb privately, in our house, his mother would be on the phone within the hour, and by the next day the narrative would be that I was unstable and volatile and making things up. I needed witnesses, not for drama, for documentation. I asked to use the following Sunday dinner as a gathering point. His family did it every few weeks, not a holiday, just a regular Sunday. His mother agreed, pleased, I think, that I was leaning into family time. Caleb seemed surprised I suggested it. I arrived early to help set the table. His grandmother was in her usual chair by the window. Roy was already there with a beer. I set my purse down near the entryway and made small talk about the weather. When everyone was seated, and the food had been passed and the conversation had settled into its usual grooves, I waited for a natural pause. Then I said, "Actually, before we eat, I need to share something with everyone." Caleb looked up. His mother set her fork down slowly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about our future," I said, "and I think everyone here deserves to understand what that future actually looks like." Caleb said quietly, "Devin." I looked at him. "I found the accounts, Caleb." The table went quiet in that specific way that means everyone is listening and pretending not to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I practiced this the way I practiced anything important, methodically until the emotion was separate from the information. $90,000 in undisclosed debt, I said. 2 accounts I didn't know existed, a business that's been operating at a loss for 14 months, funded partially by a loan that was secured using our address without my signature. His older brother started to say something. Caleb held up a hand. "This isn't the place," Caleb started. "You asked me to consolidate our finances," I said. "That would have made me legally liable for all of it. I want your family to understand what that would have meant for me." His mother stood up. "This is a family dinner. Whatever issues you two have, I have documents," I said, "for anyone who wants to see them." The table was very still. His father, who almost never spoke at these gatherings, said, "What accounts?" That was when Caleb's composure shifted. Not dramatically, it was subtle, a tightening around his jaw, a very slight change in posture. He looked at his father and then at me, and I could see him calculating. "She's exaggerating," he said. "There are some financial things we need to work out, but this isn't—" "I have the statements," I said simply. Nessa also prepared a summary, if anyone would prefer a clear breakdown. I slid the folder across the table to his father. His mother made a sound I'd never heard her make before, something between a sigh and a word she didn't finish. His father opened the folder. The next 15 minutes were not cinematic. No one flipped the table. No one screamed. What happened was quieter and more irreversible, the specific silence of people recalibrating in real time. His brothers exchanged a look. His father asked 3 specific questions in a low voice. Caleb answered 2 of them and couldn't answer the third. His grandmother, who was 81 and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, looked at me across the table and said, "When did you know?" 8 months ago, I said. She nodded slowly, like that answered a different question entirely. Caleb tried once more, on the way to the car after. His family was still inside, the air still thick with all of it. He caught my arm in the driveway. "You didn't have to do that in there," he said. "You could have come to me." "I did come to you," I said. "When you asked me to sign the paperwork, I told you I'd look it over. That was me coming to you. I meant before all this. We could have worked it out." I looked at him in the driveway of his parents' house, under the oak tree that dropped leaves all over the car every time we visited. And I thought about every dinner I'd attended, and every comment I'd absorbed, and every version of myself I'd quietly retired. We needed the same things from that conversation, I said. You needed me to sign. I needed the truth. We couldn't both win. He didn't say anything else. I drove home alone. It was a 40-minute drive, and I turned the radio off for most of it. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I felt the way I imagine you feel after a long flight. A little compressed, a little tired, but aware that you are somewhere new now and the travel is behind you. My attorney filed the paperwork the following Tuesday. The debt question was addressed as part of the dissolution proceedings. My accounts remained separate and were not touched. The business losses were assigned appropriately. His mother has not spoken to me since that Sunday. Caleb texted me once about 6 weeks after filing. He said he thought we made a mistake. I asked him which one. He didn't reply. I kept my last name, Devin Marsh. My grandmother's last name, actually. She'd given it to my mother, and my mother had given it to me, a small act of keeping something that belonged to the women in our family. I'd hyphenated it when I got married and quietly removed his name about a week after the paperwork was filed. I'm not going to tell you that what I did was easy. The version of yourself that stays quiet is in some ways easier to maintain than the one who speaks up in a dining room full of people who would rather you hadn't. There's a cost to clarity. People call it a scene. They call it unstable. They call it unstable. They call it unstable. What I know is this. If I had raised it privately, it would have been managed privately. The story would have been reshaped, softened, redirected, the way it always was. I needed it to be witnessed, not for spectacle. Because the truth has a harder time being buried when multiple people hear it at the same time. Caleb's father called me once about 2 months after. He said he wanted to apologize, not on behalf of his son. He was careful to say that, just on behalf of what he'd watched happen at his table over years without saying anything. I told him I appreciated that. I meant it. There's a version of this story where I feel angry. Some days I do. 3 years is a long time to spend being slowly convinced that your instincts are wrong, that your standards are unreasonable, that the woman you were before is someone you should be embarrassed about. But mostly what I feel now is the particular clarity of a decision that was mine. The director role turned out to be everything I'd hoped. I have my own office. My team is good. I sometimes work late, and there is no one waiting at home to be quietly off about it. I adopted a dog in January. His name is Ranger. He is opinionated and takes up most of the bed and has never once made me feel like I should be smaller than I am. That's not nothing. I learned something in that dining room in Waxhaw that I keep coming back to. Not about Caleb. Not even about his mother, who I think genuinely believed she was protecting her son. What I learned is that the people who benefit most from your silence will always be the first to call it peace. It was never peace. It was just quiet. There's a difference. And now I know exactly what each one feels like.